The tallest living thing on Earth right now is a coast redwood in Northern California named Hyperion. It stands 380 feet tall. That is the height of a 38-story building. The trunk diameter at its base measures 16 feet. Scientists discovered it in 2006 and estimated its age at between 600 and 800 years old. That makes Hyperion an adolescent by redwood standards. A mature coast redwood can live for 2,000 years. But here is what nobody talks about when they describe these trees as ancient giants. The stumps we keep finding do not match the trees we have left. August 1891, a crew working for the Dolbear and Carson Lumber Company cuts down a redwood near Crescent City, California. The stump measures 90 feet in diameter. Not the tree, the stump. For context, Hyperion measures 16 feet in diameter. This stump is more than 5 times wider. The photograph still exists in the Humboldt County Historical Society archives. In 1890, the Pacific Lumber Company photographed a stump near Scotia measuring 110 feet in diameter. Another photograph from 1915 shows a stump in Del Norte County measuring 76 feet across with a tunnel cut through it large enough to drive a Model T through with room on both sides. These are measurements taken by logging companies for commercial inventory records. Now, let me address the obvious explanation. Maybe these trees were simply larger specimens of the same species. If that were true, we should be able to extrapolate their height based on diameter to height ratios. Hyperion is 16 feet wide and 380 feet tall, a ratio of approximately 1 to 24. A 90-foot diameter stump suggests a tree over 2,000 feet tall. A 110-foot stump suggests over 2,600 feet. But trees cannot grow that tall under known physics. The cohesion tension theory that explains how water moves from roots to leaves breaks down past 426 feet. The tree would collapse under its own weight long before reaching 2,000 feet. So either the ratio is wrong, or these were not trees as we currently understand them. The Burlington Northern Railroad published track maintenance records in 1923 mentioning a fallen redwood near Eureka. The work crew reported the trunk measured 240 feet in length after breaking into sections. They estimated the original standing height at over 500 feet. The company photographer documented the removal. No living redwood has been measured above 380 feet in the modern era. The General Sherman tree in Sequoia National Park is called the largest living thing on Earth by volume. It stands 275 feet tall with a base diameter of 36 feet. The total trunk volume is 52,500 cubic feet. But in 1850, surveyor James Mason Hutchings recorded a stump in Calaveras County, measuring over 150 feet in diameter. Hutchings did not publish these measurements in his widely read California magazine because, in his words, no editor in the East would print figures so obviously fabricated. He included them only in his personal field notes, now archived at the Bancroft Library at UI Berkeley. Between 1850 and 1900, lumber companies cut down most of the accessible old-growth forest. Anything above 40 feet in diameter could not be moved with existing equipment. Logs too large were left to rot. The Stimson Mill in Ballard, Washington had the largest bandsaw on the West Coast in 1895. The maximum log diameter it could handle was 32 feet. In 1902, contractor Charles Nelson filed a complaint about unmovable timber sections in the Cascade Range. His survey described trunks measuring between 60 and 90 feet in diameter, some dead for over a century. The commission dismissed the report as exaggerated. What happened to those trunks? They rotted, they burned, they were buried, some were dynamited to clear roads, but the photographs remain, and so do the stumps. In 1978, forestry student Sarah Kohler catalogued all known redwood stumps over 50 feet in diameter for her thesis at Humboldt State. She found 47 that met the criteria, all cut before 1920. 12 measured over 70 feet across. Her thesis advisor rejected the project because the measurements could not be reconciled with accepted dendrochronology models. Kohler left the program and never published the research. Now, let me take you somewhere else. Devil's Tower, Wyoming. It rises 1,267 feet above the surrounding terrain. The National Park Service describes it as a volcanic plug. Molten rock that cooled inside a volcano then was exposed when softer material eroded away. The columns are basalt, formed by cooling and cracking of igneous rock. That is the official explanation, established in 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt declared it the first national monument. But in 1875, Colonel Richard Dodge, the man who named it, wrote that the structure reminded him of nothing so much as a colossal tree stump, its roots buried, its bark stripped by unimaginable age. The columns that make up Devil's Tower are hexagonal. Basalt columns form hexagons when magma cools slowly. You can see the same formations at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland and Fingal's Cave in Scotland. But petrified wood also forms hexagonal structures under specific mineralization conditions. When silica-rich water saturates wood over millions of years, organic cells are replaced with quartz and other minerals. The growth rings disappear. What remains looks nothing like the original tree. In 1927, paleobotanist Ralph Cheney analysed petrified wood from Yellowstone fossil forests. He noted specimens showing columnar jointing inconsistent with known wood fossilization patterns, and recommended further study. That study never happened. Between Devil's Tower in Wyoming and the Columbia River basalt flows in Washington and Oregon, there are over 40 similar formations, flat-topped mesas, sheer rock columns, hexagonal cliff faces rising hundreds of feet from the plains, all of them officially explained as volcanic. In 1962, a geologist named Edwin McKee published a paper in the Journal of Geology comparing the columnar jointing patterns in these formations with those found in confirmed basalt flows. He concluded that while most showed characteristics consistent with volcanic activity, a subset of formations displayed anomalous structural features requiring additional investigation. His follow-up research proposal was denied funding by the National Science Foundation. I need to be honest about something. I spent 3 months going through forestry archives, logging company records and geological surveys before I understood what I was looking at. Not because the information was hidden, it is all there, sitting in university libraries and historical societies. The problem was that every time I tried to assemble the pieces, I could hear how it would sound. I could hear geologists explaining that columnar jointing is a well-understood volcanic process. I could hear foresters explaining that tree diameter varies widely within a species. I could hear historians explaining that 19th century measurements were often unreliable. And all of those explanations are partially correct. But then I found the timeline. The largest stumps were cut between 1850 and 1900, 50 years. After 1900, stump diameters in logging records dropped sharply. Nothing over 50 feet is documented after 1920. Either the logging companies suddenly stopped encountering large trees, or they stopped recording them. The Weyerhaeuser Company, which became the largest private landowner in the United States, bought over 900,000 acres of timberland in Washington state in 1900. Their internal timber surveys from that era are not public record. In 2003, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by an environmental group sought access to pre-1920 Weyerhaeuser timber surveys. The company responded that the records had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1954. No other documentation of this fire exists. Meanwhile, between 1870 and 1930, the United States Geological Survey systematically reclassified dozens of geographic features in the western states. Formations previously called the Three Brothers or Giant Stump or Tower Rock were renamed and recategorized as volcanic plugs, basalt intrusions or erosional remnants. The name changes appear in USGS records without explanation. In some cases, the new classifications came decades before any geologist actually visited the site to confirm the formation type. The reclassification of Mesa Verde in Colorado from timbered plateau to sedimentary escarpment occurred in 1889. The first geological survey of the site was not conducted until 1906. What does a culture do when the evidence does not fit the story it has already agreed to tell? It renames the evidence, it reclassifies it, it catalogues it under a different heading. It does not lie, it simply makes the evidence harder to find. The photographs of 90-foot stumps are filed under historical logging operations. The anomalous geological formations are filed under volcanic features. The rejected academic research is filed under unpublished theses. Everything is archived, nothing is hidden, but the pieces never sit in the same room together long enough for anyone to notice what they build. And then there are the trees we can still see. Hyperion. General Sherman, the whole living forest we call ancient. 600 years old, 2,000 years old. Magnificent survivors. But what if they are not survivors? What if they are the second growth? The saplings that came after the original forest was removed, not by loggers, but by whatever process turned trees into mountains. A coast redwood can grow to maturity in 500 to 800 years. If the original forest disappeared between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, the current trees would be the third or fourth generation growing in the same soil. We would have no memory of what came before. We would only have stumps too large to move, and photographs no one believed. The Hyperion tree stands 380 feet tall. It is the tallest living thing we have measured. But in Sequoia National Park there is a stump called the burnt monarch. It measures 40 feet in diameter. Park rangers tell visitors it is the remains of a giant sequoia that burned in a fire centuries ago. But giant sequoias and coast redwoods are different species. They do not grow in the same places. The burnt monarch sits in an area where no giant sequoia has ever been recorded growing in modern times. The Park Service explanation is that climate conditions were different when the tree was alive, allowing giant sequoias to grow further north than they do today. That explanation requires believing that climate shifted enough to change the entire range of a species, but not enough to leave any other evidence in the geological or botanical record. It also requires believing that only one tree of that species grew there, because no other giant sequoia stumps or remains have been found anywhere near the burnt monarch. So here is the question no one has properly asked. If the stumps measuring over 70 feet in diameter are from the same species as modern redwoods, where are the young ones? Where are the 40-foot saplings that should be growing into 60-foot adolescents that would eventually become the next generation of giants? They do not exist. The current forest has trees of all ages, from seedlings to 2,000-year-old elders, but the diameter distribution stops abruptly around 36 feet. That is the General Sherman cutoff. Nothing modern comes close to the stump sizes photographed in the 19th century. It is as if the species changed, or as if what we are calling the same species is actually something different that moved in after the original version disappeared. The mythology does not need to be explicit to do its work. You do not tell people that mountains are trees. You call them volcanic plugs. You do not tell people that the forest they are looking at is the second growth. You call it old growth and ancient. You do not tell people that the measurements in the archives are accurate. You file them under historical curiosity. The story tells itself through classification, through naming, through what gets funding and what gets forgotten. And after 150 years, the forest we have is the forest we think has always been here. The trees we can see are the only trees we believe existed, and the stumps that do not fit the model become anomalies we learn to ignore. What story does a civilization tell itself when the scale of what came before is too large to process? What do you call something when the truth makes the present look diminished by comparison? You call it mythology, you call it exaggeration, you call it poor science, and then you move on. The redwoods are still here, Hyperion still stands, the parks are protected, the forest is safe. That story is clean, that story is manageable. That story does not require anyone to reconsider what a tree can be or what the landscape looked like before we started naming it. And maybe that story is exactly what happened. Maybe the stumps are outliers and the columns are volcanic and the measurements were wrong and the archive fires were real and the reclassifications were justified and the funding denials were appropriate and the pattern is just coincidence stretched across a century and a continent. Or maybe what we call the redwood forest is the garden that grew back after something much larger was removed, and maybe the mountains were never volcanoes at all.